The last thing Eleanor Whitmore expected to find at her son's grave was a stranger sobbing in the morning fog. The second was that the child clinging to her looked exactly like him. Eleanor had made this visit ritual, always the first Sunday of the month, always alone. It had been 6 years since Grayson's death, and she still hadn't made peace with it. Her life since then had been silence padded by money. CEO of Whitmore Holdings, one of the wealthiest women in New York, and still utterly powerless against grief. So when she saw a young black woman knelt before Grayson's headstone in row 17 of Winterfield Cemetery, Eleanor froze. The woman's shoulders trembled with grief, her face half hidden beneath a knit hat. Beside her stood a boy, small, no older than 6, with familiar storm-gray eyes and a defiant little chin that mirrored Grayson's high school portraits. Eleanor's voice cut through the wind. "What are you doing here?" The woman looked up, startled, wiping tears from her face. I'm sorry. We didn't mean to intrude. You know him?" Eleanor's voice was clipped, almost sharp. She had spent years building walls, and they weren't about to crumble for a stranger. The woman stood slowly, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Yes," she said. "My name is Mira Langston. This is my son, Jace. He's Grayson's." Eleanor's world tilted. The cemetery faded behind a fog of disbelief. Grayson never mentioned a child. Mira nodded slowly. "He didn't know. I found out after he died." Silence. Cold and hollow. The kind that lives between two women on opposite ends of a secret neither of them asked for. Eleanor studied the boy. Jace stared back, his face calm but curious. There was no denying the resemblance. The tilt of his brow, the depth of his eyes, it was Grayson all over again. "Why now?" Eleanor asked, her voice more breath than sound. "I never planned to keep him from you," Mira said quietly. "But I wasn't sure if I, or he, would ever be welcome." There was no time to answer. Mira turned, gently urging Jace forward. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. As they walked away, Eleanor remained frozen beside her son's grave, her fingers gripping the roses she had brought. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the wind. Grayson was gone. But the boy was real. Breathing. Laughing. Alive. And Eleanor Whitmore, for the first time in years, didn't know what to do next. Back inside her penthouse perched above Fifth Avenue, Eleanor Whitmore stood motionless in her private study, the skyline of Manhattan glittering behind her like broken glass. The encounter at Winterfield Cemetery replayed in her mind like a scene she couldn't rewrite. Mira Langston. Jace. Her grandson. The revelation had cracked something open inside her, something she hadn't even realized was buried. She pressed a button on her desk phone. "Simon, I want a full report. Everything on Mira Langston. Where she works. Who she associates with. Where she's lived. I want it quietly, and I want it fast." Simon, her longtime personal assistant and fixer, didn't ask questions. Understood. Within 48 hours, Eleanor had a thick folder in her hands. It was heavier than she expected. Mira Langston. 27 years old. Currently employed as a waitress at a midtown bistro. Previously worked part-time cleaning offices overnight and taking shifts at a laundromat on weekends. No spouse. No partner. No formal custody filings for the child. No paternity test. No record of child support. No birth certificate listing Grayson Whitmore as the father. No photos of the two together. Just a boy with a Whitmore face living in a world far removed from marble floors and chauffeured sedans. Eleanor read it all in silence, flipping through pages filled with hardship, grit, and survival. Rent receipts. Emergency room visits. School enrollment paperwork. Mira had done everything herself. There was no sign of drugs, crime, or instability. But also, no sign of privilege or protection. Mira Langston was invisible, until now. Eleanor tapped her manicured fingernail on the photo of the boy, Jace. Her heir. Her blood. And suddenly, a cold sense of urgency rose in her chest. This boy belonged to a different world. A harder one. And Eleanor wasn't going to let that stand. She reached again for the phone. Bring Mira Langston here. Tomorrow morning. Alone. Mira stood in front of Whitmore Tower, dwarfed by the gleaming skyscraper. It rose above the Manhattan skyline like a monument to inherited wealth and untouchable power. Clad in her plain navy coat, her hands trembling slightly in the pockets, she hesitated for a full minute before pushing open the glass doors. Inside, the lobby was marble and silence. Uniformed security guards flanked the elevator bay, and a woman at the reception desk offered her a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Miss Langston. Mira nodded. You're expected on the 43rd floor. The elevator ride felt eternal. At the top, a private assistant with a Bluetooth in his ear met her with a nod and led her into a sprawling office that looked more like a museum than a workspace. Sunlight spilled across sleek art pieces and hand-carved furniture. But nothing could soften the chill that filled the room as Eleanor Whitmore stood behind a massive desk, her presence cutting through the space like a knife. Miss Langston, Eleanor said, gesturing to a chair. Sit. Mira sat. Straight back. Chin up. There was a pause before Eleanor opened a drawer and placed a checkbook on the desk. She filled in the amount with deliberate strokes, then tore it off and laid it on the polished wood. $200,000. Untaxed. That's enough to cover a new life somewhere. California, perhaps. Or Europe. You'll never have to wait tables again. All I ask is custody. Mira didn't reach for the check. She didn't even glance at the number. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. It's more than generous. Mira finally spoke, her voice even. You can't buy your way into his life. Eleanor's mouth tightened. He's a Whitmore. That comes with responsibilities. And protection. Things you cannot give him. He's also a Langston, Mira said. And what I give him isn't measured in bank balances. I give him love. Stability. Truth. You want to erase all that with a pen stroke? Eleanor leaned forward, voice icy. I lost my son. I won't lose his legacy to a waitress in a rented apartment. Mira stood, the chair barely making a sound as she pushed it back. You already lost him. Not because of me. Because you treated him like a legacy. Not a person. I won't let you do that to Jace. The two women stared at each other, a war of silence stretching between them. One backed by wealth and lawyers. The other by resolve. Mira walked to the door. Her voice was quiet but firm. You don't know me. But you should have asked before trying to buy my child. And she left. Eleanor sat frozen for a long moment. The check still sat on the table, untouched. Her hand hovered over it, then clenched into a fist. She picked up the phone again. Simon. Get me my legal team. I'm taking her to court. Eleanor's legal team moved fast. Within a week, her attorneys had drafted the paperwork to initiate custody proceedings against Mira Langston. The strategy was clear. Prove Mira to be financially unfit, emotionally unstable, and incapable of providing the future Jace Whitmore deserved. The goal wasn't just to win. It was to crush. But Mira didn't fold. Not even close. The summons arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Mira stood in her kitchen, holding the thick envelope with trembling fingers. It wasn't unexpected, Eleanor had made her intentions clear. But the weight of it still stole the breath from her lungs. She poured a cup of coffee, sat on her threadbare couch, and stared at the custody petition. Jace was still asleep in the next room, his superhero pajamas twisted around his small legs. Mira blinked away the sting in her eyes. They weren't going down without a fight. By that afternoon, Mira had made a phone call. One. Just one. The next morning, Eleanor's attorney, Gerald Blake, paced inside her office, pale and tense. "She's retained Morrison, Caldwell and Pierce," he said, almost whispering. Eleanor frowned. "Who?" "They're the top civil rights firm in the Northeast. They've taken on the Department of Defense. Won multi-million-dollar race discrimination cases. They don't just take clients, they make statements." Eleanor's lips curled into a tight line. "She's trying to turn this into a media circus. She doesn't have to. The moment word gets out that you're trying to take a black child from his working-class mother based on wealth alone, I'm not." "You are," Blake interrupted carefully. "And optics matter." Eleanor turned to the window. Below her, the city pulsed with life. She was used to controlling the narrative. But now, for the first time, someone had forced her to pause. Mira wasn't just fighting for her son. She had drawn a line in the sand, and powerful allies were standing behind her. That evening, Mira sat at her Aunt Helen's small kitchen table, surrounded by a very different kind of power. Professor Lila Monroe, a civil rights scholar and constitutional law expert. Trevor Shaw, a seasoned investigative journalist. And Helen Green, once a housekeeper at the Whitmore estate, now a quiet observer of its every scandal. They reviewed everything: old documents, financial ledgers, unfiled reports, whispers of illegal contributions and offshore accounts, all pointing back to Whitmore Holdings. "We can beat her in court," Monroe said. "But if she escalates, we take it public." Mira nodded. "She came after my son. Now she'll see how long I've been preparing." Monday morning arrived like a hammer blow. The front page of the Metropolitan Times didn't pull punches: Whitmore Empire under investigation, allegations of fraud, bribery, and systemic abuse. Beneath the headline sat a damning photo of Eleanor Whitmore exiting a black SUV, her expression stony, her pearl earrings catching the morning light like gilt. Inside the article, journalist Trevor Shaw detailed everything. Every off-the-books deal, every phantom company, every falsified tax filing. It wasn't just a hit piece, it was a masterfully constructed expose, backed by documents, former employees' testimonies, and leaked internal memos. It had Myra's fingerprints all over it. The article trended nationally within hours. Shareholders panicked. Board members called emergency meetings. Lawyers scrambled to spin the story into something salvageable. But there was no spin. Only fallout. At the SEC headquarters, investigators launched a formal inquiry into Whitmore Holdings. The IRS opened a new audit. And by noon, the FBI had issued a search warrant for multiple corporate offices. Eleanor sat in her study, the television muted but still flashing headlines. She hadn't spoken to Simon in hours. Gerald Blake, once confident and brash, now appeared like a man trying to hold back a tidal wave with a teacup. "They have a whistleblower," he said, pale and sweating. "They've got internal documents. They knew where to look." Eleanor stared at him. "She did this." Gerald didn't have to ask who. They both knew. Meanwhile, Mira sat at a folding table in the small basement of her community legal center. It was cramped, the chairs were mismatched, but the energy in the room was electric. Professor Monroe read the article aloud, stopping only to annotate the implications of each revelation. Trevor beamed. Helen watched in silence, her expression unreadable. "They're reeling," Monroe said. "They didn't expect a full frontal assault. They expected a mother with no resources," Mira replied. "Not a movement." Monroe nodded. "You've shifted public opinion. We keep this pressure up, Eleanor won't risk stepping into a courtroom. She'll settle, quietly. But Mira didn't want quiet. She wanted truth. The next day, Eleanor attempted damage control. Her PR team issued a statement framing the article as a politically motivated smear campaign. But no one bought it. Former Whitmore employees were now coming forward daily, each one adding fuel to the blaze. The board of Whitmore Holdings voted to suspend Eleanor from active duty. The stock price cratered. 3 major investors pulled out. At the same time, Morrison, Caldwell and Pierce filed a countersuit against Eleanor for attempted coercion, defamation, and unlawful interference in a custody matter. The case now had not just civil implications, but criminal ones. Still, Eleanor refused to retreat. She launched a lawsuit of her own, doubling down on her claim that Mira was unfit. She appeared on a carefully edited news segment, portraying herself as a grieving grandmother desperate to save her grandson. But by then, the public had already chosen sides. Talk shows praised Mira's strength. Op-eds questioned the ethics of billionaires using family court to erase working-class mothers. Social media had crowned Mira a modern-day David against Goliath. And Goliath was losing. Eleanor watched it all unfold like someone drowning in slow motion. She hadn't just underestimated Mira, she had underestimated how far Mira was willing to go. How deeply prepared she had been. How many people she'd inspired. And in the stillness of her now quiet office, Eleanor was faced with a terrifying thought. What if she wasn't the story's hero? What if she had always been the villain? 2 weeks after the Metropolitan exposé, the fallout hadn't stopped, it had intensified. The SEC, the IRS, and the FBI weren't just investigating Whitmore Holdings, they were pulling back layers of corruption that stretched back over 2 decades. Eleanor's financial empire, once untouchable, was crumbling under the weight of its secrets. But the real reckoning was yet to come. At Morrison, Caldwell and Pierce, Mira sat across from her legal team, listening intently as Professor Monroe outlined their next strategy. Eleanor is attempting to weaponize the family court system. But we have a constitutional argument prepared: racial bias, abuse of process, and economic coercion. This won't just be about Jace. This will be a precedent-setting case. Mira nodded. She's taken everything from me but him. She won't take my son. Helen, quiet until now, placed a folder on the table. She also took something else. Something no one else has seen yet. The room went silent. Inside the folder were documents, handwritten letters, journals, and correspondence between Grayson and Helen, going back years. Letters Grayson had asked Helen to keep safe in case anything ever happened to him. Inside, he detailed his growing suspicions about Eleanor's offshore accounts, his moral discomfort with the company's laundering activities, and his plans to leave and go public. In the final letter, written just days before his death, Grayson confessed he feared someone inside Whitmore Holdings was watching him. That if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be an accident. Tears welled in Myra's eyes as she read the final lines. I don't know how this ends. But if it does end, I want Mira and our son to know the truth. I want them safe. I want them free. Monroe stared at the letter, her legal mind turning. This changes everything. If he was killed to protect the empire, then Eleanor isn't just facing civil charges, she's facing conspiracy and potentially homicide. Trevor Shaw leaned forward. Let me publish it. Mira hesitated. Are you sure we're ready for that? We need the public on our side, Monroe added. It will force the DOJ to open a criminal case. And it will bury her in a way no courtroom ever could. Mira closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and nodded. Let the world see it. The Metropolitan Times ran a special edition, The Grayson Letters, A Son's Confession from Beyond the Grave. Within hours, it became the most read digital article in the paper's history. Major outlets picked up the story. Hashtags surged. Congressional leaders called for hearings. The Department of Justice announced a formal inquiry into the suspicious circumstances of Grayson Whitmore's death. Eleanor tried to release a statement calling the letters fabricated, but forensic analysts authenticated the handwriting. Her voice, once commanding, now rang hollow. That night, federal agents raided her primary residence. The next morning, Eleanor Whitmore was arrested on charges of obstruction of justice, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The homicide investigation into Grayson's death was officially reopened. At Myra's apartment, there were no cheers. Just silence. Jace sat at the kitchen table drawing with crayons while Myra stood by the window, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the clouds. "Is she going to jail forever?" he asked softly. Myra knelt beside him. "I don't know, baby. That's not up to me. But she did bad things." "She did," Myra said, brushing a curl from his forehead. "But we did good things. We told the truth." Jace nodded and went back to coloring. And Myra, finally, allowed herself to exhale. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the visitor room of the Metropolitan Detention Center. Her signature silk scarf had been replaced by a dull gray jumpsuit, and the polish that once defined her image was buried under weeks of stress and scrutiny. Her attorney, Gerald Blake, sat across from her, eyes downcast. "There's a chance we can negotiate a deal," he murmured. Eleanor said nothing. "But you have to give them something big. Names, transactions, offshore details. Something they can't ignore." She leaned back in the plastic chair, mind spinning. It wasn't just about survival anymore. Her legacy, Grayson's memory, had already been shattered. And strangely, the one person she now found herself thinking about was Myra. Across town, Myra sat on a bench outside the courthouse with Professor Monroe and Helen. News vans lined the street. Cameras waited. But Myra kept her focus on the clouds rolling above, her hand loosely holding Jace's. He was safe, smiling as he nibbled on a granola bar, oblivious to the media storm brewing. Monroe broke the silence. "Eleanor's lawyers want a meeting. Private. No cameras. No press." Myra blinked. "Why?" "They didn't say. But it's a negotiation." "She's finally blinking." Myra considered it. She didn't trust Eleanor, but she was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of living on edge. The next day, Myra stepped into a private conference room in the courthouse basement. Eleanor was already there, dressed in prison attire but still sitting with dignity. Her eyes met Myra's. "You came," Eleanor said softly. "I'm not here for you," Myra replied. Eleanor sighed. "I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted you to hear it from me. I failed Grayson. I let ambition swallow everything else. And now," she looked away, "now I've lost everything." Myra didn't respond. "But Jace," Eleanor continued, "he doesn't have to grow up in this shadow. I'm willing to sign over full guardianship, no contest. No press. No court battle." Myra's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because I was wrong. And because I know you'll raise him right." Grayson knew it too. There was a long silence. Finally, Myra nodded. "Then put it in writing." 3 days later, the court granted Myra full legal custody of Jace Langston Whitmore. The motion passed quietly, sealed from public records to protect the child. Outside, reporters clamored for statements, but Myra simply lifted Jace into her arms and walked past the microphones. Eleanor watched the news from her cell, the screen flickering with images of Myra's quiet grace. There was no malice in her expression. Only peace. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor closed her eyes, and didn't feel rage. Spring arrived with a sense of quiet redemption. The cherry blossoms in Central Park bloomed brighter than anyone remembered, and for the first time in years, Myra Langston breathed without fear. She had traded in the cramped apartment for a modest brownstone in Harlem, purchased through a modest inheritance left in Grayson's name. She didn't flaunt the money. She didn't need to. What mattered now was building a future for Jace, rooted in love, truth, and security. On Saturday mornings, they walked to the local library. On Sundays, they cooked pancakes together. Mira enrolled in night classes at Columbia, public policy. A dream Grayson once had whispered into life again. Jace had started kindergarten. His teachers adored him, his friends flocked to him. But more importantly, he laughed. Loud and free. No longer weighed down by whispers and courtrooms. One afternoon, as Mira helped Jace with a science project on the solar system, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a short note from Eleanor. Mira, thank you for saving my grandson from my legacy. You gave him what I never could give Grayson, a future made of truth. Eleanor, there was no apology. But there was honesty. And Mira respected that more. In the months that followed, Mira reconnected with people she had pushed away during the chaos. She joined a civic engagement nonprofit, using her story to help other mothers navigate custody battles, especially those at the mercy of powerful families. She stood on panels. She taught workshops. She made allies of people who once viewed her as nothing more than an underdog. And she never once forgot the women who helped her stand up in the first place. Professor Monroe nominated her for a local advocacy award. Trevor's follow-up series on whistleblowers became a national bestseller. Helen, quiet and proud, finally retired from cleaning houses. And Jace? He began asking about his father with curiosity, not sorrow. Was Daddy brave? He asked one night. Mira smiled. The bravest. One day, Jace came home from school with a crayon drawing, a house, a son, and 3 people standing hand in hand. This is you, me, and Daddy, he said. Even though he's not here, I think he's still part of us. Mira held back tears. He always will be. Outside, the city pulsed on. But inside their home, there was only warmth. After all the courtrooms, headlines, and betrayals, what remained was simple. A mother. A son. A future reclaimed. It had been nearly a year since Eleanor Whitmore's arrest. Her trial was still pending, but the energy surrounding it had cooled, replaced by a quiet anticipation of justice. Mira, now thriving in her advocacy work, found herself being invited to places she'd once never imagined. From nonprofit roundtables to statehouse policy panels, she was shaping reform. Still, something tugged at her, a need to return to where it had all started. One crisp morning, she brought Jace back to Winterfield Cemetery. This time, there were no tears. Jace walked confidently next to her, holding a single flower he'd picked himself. Can I put it down? He asked. She nodded. Go ahead. He knelt, placed the flower gently at Grayson's headstone, then stood beside Mira again. He'd be proud of you, she whispered. Of both of us. Jace looked up at her, eyes solemn. Do you think he knows what we did? Mira smiled softly. I think he knows everything that matters. Back in the city, the Whitmore name had undergone a transformation. No longer synonymous with excess and intimidation, it now lived in headlines about corporate accountability and legal precedent. The lawsuits had paved the way for new protections against wealth-based custody interference. Mira had become a symbol, not by choice, but by necessity. And yet, she was careful never to lose the simplicity of her life. She kept Jace grounded. Sunday pancakes. Library trips. Walking through the Harlem streets hand in hand. On the anniversary of the initial custody hearing, Mira was invited to speak at a national summit on judicial equity. She hesitated at first, still unsure if she belonged among senators and CEOs. But Professor Monroe encouraged her. You don't speak for status, she'd said. You speak for truth. Myra's speech that day drew a standing ovation. Not because she was eloquent or dramatic, but because she was honest. She told the story of a mother who fought not just for her child, but for her dignity. Afterward, an older woman approached her backstage. She wore a worn coat and had tears in her eyes. I just wanted to say thank you, the woman said. You made me feel seen. Myra embraced her. We're all meant to be seen. Later that week, Myra received another letter. This one was postmarked from Eleanor's prison facility. Inside was a copy of a trust document, naming Jace as the sole inheritor of all remaining Whitmore assets. Myra, this world took Grayson from both of us. I can't change that. But I can ensure Jace has a future we failed to give his father. Let him choose a different path. Eleanor. Myra folded the letter gently. She hadn't expected redemption. But perhaps, in the end, Eleanor had found her own form of it. The following weekend, Myra and Jace walked by the river. He asked questions about the stars again. She answered as best she could, watching his mind reach for more. Someday, he'd grow up and read the headlines. He'd ask deeper questions. And Myra would be ready. But for now, she simply held his hand and smiled. The wind swept through the trees, and the city moved on. But their story, Grayson's story, had found its peace. The first time Jace stood behind a microphone, it wasn't in a courtroom or a school assembly, it was at the dedication of the Whitmore Langston Foundation. He was 8 years old, clutching Myra's hand as she knelt beside him, whispering encouragement. The foundation's opening marked the conversion of a former Whitmore Holdings boardroom into a youth advocacy center. The plaque on the wall read, "In honor of Grayson Whitmore." A voice silenced. A legacy reclaimed. Myra took the stage afterward, her voice clear and measured. We created this place not out of bitterness, but out of belief, that no child should have to fight alone against the weight of injustice. This foundation belongs to every family whose voice has ever been ignored. And to every child who will now be heard. Applause filled the room. But for Myra, the loudest praise came later that evening when Jace, curled up beside her on the couch, said, "Daddy would have liked it, right?" She kissed his forehead. He would have loved it. Months passed, and the foundation grew quickly. Myra assembled a team of community leaders, educators, and legal advocates to expand services across the city. They launched initiatives for underserved families, from legal aid to parental training, and even helped rewrite legislation on custody reform. Myra became a symbol not just of survival, but of progress. She was invited to speak at universities, consulted on family law policies, and featured on national news segments. But she remained rooted in her purpose, building a future for Jace and families like theirs. Despite the spotlight, Myra never forgot the silence that once surrounded her. She kept a copy of Grayson's final letter locked in her desk, rereading it during moments of doubt. It reminded her why she fought. Why she still fought. On the 5th anniversary of Grayson's death, Myra and Jace returned to Winterfield Cemetery once more. But this time, they weren't alone. Trevor Shaw, Professor Monroe, Helen, and dozens of supporters from the foundation came with them. The crowd formed a circle as Myra laid fresh lilies at the base of the headstone. Jace, now 10 and taller than ever, stepped forward with confidence. "My dad didn't get to grow up with me," he began. "But everything I do to make him proud. He didn't just leave me behind. He left all of us something. A reason to be brave." The crowd stood in reverent silence. Not just in mourning, but in honor. As the sun set, Myra felt a warmth rise in her chest. Not just grief, not just pride, something deeper. A knowing. Grayson's life had not been in vain. His voice, once stifled, now echoed through the halls of justice, policy, and community. And Jace, bright, curious, and fierce, was that voice made new. Their story was no longer just one of pain and resistance. It had become a legacy. The journey of Mira Langston and her son Jace is a reminder that true legacy is not built through wealth or titles, but through courage, love, and unshakable integrity. In a world often tilted in favor of power and privilege, it's easy to feel invisible or voiceless. But this story teaches us that resilience grounded in truth can shake empires. Mira, a single mother with no political influence or financial resources, stood her ground, not out of anger, but out of love. She believed in her right to protect her child and refused to be silenced by intimidation, money, or legacy. Her quiet determination became a force that unraveled generations of corruption and gave rise to real change. Eleanor Whitmore, once the embodiment of unchecked authority, was ultimately humbled not by scandal, but by the quiet conviction of the very woman she tried to erase. In the end, it wasn't the headlines or the courtrooms that left the deepest mark. It was the quiet acts of bravery, the letters preserved, the truths told, and the child raised with dignity. For adults and seniors reflecting on what truly matters, this story reminds us that it's never too late to correct our course, to leave behind something meaningful, and to stand for what is right, even when doing so is inconvenient or costly. Whether you're a parent, a mentor, or simply someone still defining your purpose, remember this: legacies are not built in boardrooms, they're built in hearts, in homes, and in the moments we choose love over fear, and truth over silence. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell for future stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. And let us know in the comments, what kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?